So I've read, over the last month or so, I've read about 6 books. I've got a pile of books here I wanted to talk about and just go over my thoughts on each one. The first book that I want to talk about is Tower of Glass by Robert Silverberg. This was a really good science fiction book. I've read a few Silverbergs. This one is about like this industrialist type of character, tycoon character that builds a huge, like the largest tower in the world out of glass in the Canadian Shield with the help of an army of like androids. And the plot that I thought was really interesting in the book was there's this story arc of the son of the industrialist has this affair with this android, and there's different types of androids. So there's the alphas that are the most advanced or the most human-like, and they're pretty much indistinguishable from humans. At least that's the sense that I got. And then there's more like rudimentary style androids that are more obviously robotic and looking and more mechanical, I guess, or less intelligent, so to speak. And the story kind of follows the son of the industrialist with this alpha android, where they fall in love with each other, but the relationship turns out to be not at all what the son expected it to be. And this android there's this other affair she's got going on with another android, and it gets really interesting. And yeah, I just thought it was a really well-written book. It's really good for Silverberg. It's probably not his best. So my favorite Silverberg is Dying Inside. I really liked that one. It's probably not as good as that, but it's a good read. And the next book I read was, this is a history book. This is Prague in Black and Gold by Peter Demetz. And so I went with my family to Prague recently and for a couple weeks and had such a good time. And I got a couple books when I was there. I got this and a book on Rudolph II that's really good. And Rudolph II is one of my favorite historical figures to read about, probably my favorite, because he had, not so much because his own life was interesting particularly, but he was this really eccentric Habsburg monarch that ruled from Prague and did a lot of good for Prague itself and the arts at the time. But he invited all these eccentric characters to the palace, like Kepler and John Dee and Edward Kelly and all these weird historical figures that I knew nothing about. This book is pretty good at explaining those characters. The prose is a little dry for my taste sometimes, but so the 2 sections I liked the most were the parts on Charles IV and then Rudolph II. So there's just this one paragraph I wanted to talk about specifically because it's really well written. And if you have a interest in the history of Prague or the Czech Republic or Charles IV, you'll probably find this interesting. So, and I didn't know any of this before reading this book, but in the early 14th century, Prague was going through a really dark period, and it was there was all this in foreign invasions from other powers, anarchy, revolt, plunder, hunger, and pestilence. And this is at the beginning of chapter 3, the one about Charles IV and the Carolinian moment. So Demetz says, to bury the many corpses, big ditches were hastily dug near many parish churches, and near St. Peter's, 2,000 bodies were thrown into a single ditch, and rumors told of a physician who was buried alive and survived chewing on the flesh of the corpses until he was saved by the astonished people. And then later in the paragraph, he talks about everyone was going through this mass starvation, and the people that lived in a village nearby Prague called Obora, near the town gates, a hungry mother and her son murdered a beggar woman for a few slivers of bread, but when the son dragged the corpse away, he was arrested and immediately hanged while his mother escaped. And I thought that was just a well-written paragraph about describing how different life was back then in the I guess this would be High Middle Ages or early 14th century. And this writer, Demetz, he does a pretty good job of getting across how different this period was. And when you go to Prague, and I had this opinion too, that the city is just it's so beautiful. That's what strikes you immediately when you're in the city, that there's all this beautiful art and architecture everywhere. And all wherever you go in the city, like Old Town especially, but also Mala Strana and the Charles Bridge, and it seems like of course, the Prague Castle and that whole area, you're surrounded by all these Baroque and Rook style buildings everywhere, from the 16th and 17th centuries, 18th century buildings, and you're constantly reminded of the beauty of the city. But this book, as its title says, like In Black and Gold, there's a lot. The Prague has just as much of a violent history as many of the other, London or Paris or any of the other European cities. And this book, I think, does a good job of talking about that. And then the part on Rudolf II is also really good. I won't go into detail about what he talks about in here, but that book, the whole part on John Dee and Edward Kelly, is really fascinating. And I recommend this book. It's really good. And then the next one I read was the new Odyssey translation by Daniel Mendelsohn. This was really strong. I've read the Odyssey a few times, and this one I really liked. This one, so Mendelsohn I think, took this approach where he didn't want to use like the same and recycle the same lines that recent translators do. Like if you read Fagles and Emily Wilson, a lot of the phrases that Homer repeats over and over again, like rosy-fingered dawn and hollowed ships, Mendelsohn scrutinizes every line, but it doesn't come across that way. He's very smooth, and the narrative is strong in his translation. And he kind of, in his introduction, he talks about what his goals were with this translation, and how he wanted to strike a balance as much as he could between Richmond Lattimore, who wanted to elevate Homer, a balance between that and the more recent translations like Emily Wilson and Fagles, who often wanted to make Homer more readable and bring that Homer into a non-classical audience, and maybe, if you will, simplify things a little bit and highlight the plainness of the characters and make them more relatable. Mendelsohn, I got the sense that he wanted to strike a balance between those two, and it's really well done. It's fascinating. Especially, I really loved the books 9 through 12 that are the more, when Odysseus is explaining all the stories, all of the trials and tribulations he had to go through with the Cyclops and everything. That part of the book is very good. And then it's strong even to the end. Like when I read Emily Wilson's Odyssey, I felt like it was the ending, like the last 5 or 6 books are not as good as the beginning, where it's talking more about Telemachus and Odysseus's struggles. But once you get to the suitors, I like books, well, even halfway through the book, the Odyssey kind of loses its momentum a little bit after book 12. And Mendelssohn, it's still really good even after that. And another thing Mendelssohn does is emphasize how important the last book is, book 24, when Odysseus is reunited with his father, and you get the Agamemnon, or the ghost of Agamemnon, talking to the ghost of Achilles, and how important that is with resolving the plot that was first, or the argument or conflict rather, that was first established way back at the beginning of the Iliad. And if we think of the Odyssey as a sequel to the Iliad in a sense, that book 24 of the Odyssey really brings us full circle. And I never thought of that before Mendelssohn mentions it in his introduction, but he's right in that the ghost of Agamemnon in book 24, he talks about, he discusses or tells Achilles about the funeral that they had for Achilles. And it really, I think, reconciles the relationship between those two characters and also that story arc. And I thought that was interesting. But it's such a good translation, and I think if you really like Homer, you should read it. It's really good. I also really like Fegel's Odyssey, is very strong, and Peter Green's is really good too. I think Peter Green had kind of a similar approach to Mendelssohn, where he wanted to kind of scrutinize his lines more. But yeah, I really like that book. And then the next one is The Time of the Wolf by James Wilde. This is a book about 11th century England. It's a novel about this real historical figure called Hereward. And he was this character from Mercia that was this like bloodthirsty warrior type of character that he was in real life, he was actually a minor historical figure, but he's the protagonist of this book, of this novel. And this guy, he does a good job with bringing the character to life. And it's kind of, it's not a fantasy book. It's just about Hereward and his friend that he travels with, this monk type of character. And it's all of the like Tostig and a lot of the English monarchs like King Edward, and a lot of the monarchs of the time are mentioned. They make an appearance in this book. And the Vikings in Northumbria, he talks about, they make an appearance in the book. And if you like that this period of history, you would love this book, and it's pretty good. So, and then the next book, the last two books I read were both World War II history. So the first one was The End by Ian Kershaw. This was recommended by a few other booktubers, and so that I really like watching on YouTube. So I was excited about this one. And what this book does is talks about, first of all, how doomed Nazi Germany was after Stalingrad, but especially by the middle of 1944, the whole war for the Germans was pretty much pointless. And there were a few Germans in the officers and in the high command that knew this. We have their journals, so we know that like Albert Speer and a few others like Rommel knew that the war was pointless. Rommel was one of the ones that figured out pretty quick that the war, whatever army gets resupplied the best is going to win. And but the focus of this book is more on not only how doomed the war was for the Germans, but also why they, for a year or two, why they kept pursuing a pointless war. And, a lot of it was, Ian Kershaw says, is about what, the Nazi regime, how they indoctrinated even the intelligent officers and the high command, from Hitler down, he was able to convince himself and everyone below him that they had to fight to the end, and victory was still pursuable. And like Albert Speer is in the book, and Speer seemed to think that, Kershaw mentions that Speer really prolonged the war and that he was able to very cleverly allocate resources to the home industry to keep war production going against massive shortages, to the point where citizens were being deprived of resources that were now being allocated to the Wehrmacht and the war effort. And how Kershaw says the war probably would have ended several months sooner if Speer wasn't so good at his job at allocating all these war resources. And he talks about how Goebbels didn't believe the war was being lost because of the lack of resources. He was convinced that the German people had lost their sense of motivation, and that's why they were losing the war. And Kershaw brings to life, I think, these historical figures in a way that, like, I knew everything I know about the war, especially against the Soviet Union, between the Soviet Union and Germany, everything I know about that aspect of World War II, I learned from this book. And there's a pretty good section, like 60 or 70 page section on the war with Russia or the Soviet Union. And that's fascinating. How I always thought of as the Normandy landings and Operation Overlord being the turning point in the war against Germany, but that wasn't at all the case. Germany was being bled of resources for years by fighting a pointless war in the east against Stalingrad and other parts of Russia, Moscow and Leningrad. And Kershaw talks about another aspect I knew nothing about was the total, almost complete destruction of Army Group Center, when the Germans obviously refused to surrender, to the point where Army Group Center was completely annihilated by the Soviets. And it goes to show that Germany, had they surrendered 2 years before they did, they would have been much better positioned to negotiate terms after the war, because by April of 1945, the Soviets had conquered so much of Poland and the Baltic states and Eastern Germany that the Soviets were better positioned than any other power to negotiate terms. And it made me wonder, if the Germans had surrendered after Stalingrad, how, in January 1943, maybe their negotiating position would have been much better, or how that would have worked out. But it was a fascinating book. It was very good. And then that whetted my appetite for this book, which was recommended to me too. This is Absolute War by Chris Bellamy. And this is all about the war in the East, the Soviets fighting the Germans. So it starts off with the months leading up to Barbarossa and Operation Barbarossa itself, and what the decision making was like on the German side, and then how the Soviets, being very clever on watching the Germans, how they attacked, and the Soviets were able to mount these very strategic counterattacks that were usually not successful the same day they launched the counterattacks. But what the counterattacks did was they slowly slowed down the advance of the Germans, to the point where instead of taking 1 day to take a city or a town, it would take a week to accomplish the same objective. And over the course of 3 or 4 years, this it was disaster eventually for the Germans. And that's how the Soviets were eventually able to slow down the German advance, move their industry east, and basically outproduce the Germans. And the last thing I wanted to talk about this book is it's got this brilliant section on Stalin and so in October of 1941, that was when it was the most bleak for the Soviets. And a lot of the Soviet high command, I didn't know this, but they had completely evacuated Moscow. The Soviets were convinced, many of them, that the Germans were going to take Moscow. And so most of the party officials fled, and Stalin did not, which I didn't know. And Stalin actually, and I knew that Stalin was taken by surprise by Barbarossa and the German attack, but I didn't know that he was so convinced that it would never happen. Like Stalin, even hours or days after Barbarossa, after the Germans were attacking in Poland, the Russian forces in Poland, or the Soviet forces, Stalin was still convinced that, it's propaganda from the West. It's not actually happening. There's no way Hitler would attack us. And he was totally delusional. I never knew that. But there's a section on, and I never knew of the coup that was planned. Stalin was actually around, I think, October of 41. Stalin was actually threatened by the party, and he was, if there was going to be a coup against Stalin and a party like someone else replacing Stalin, it would have been during that time in October of 41, when it was the outlook for the Soviets was the most bleak. And so this is on page 228, when Bellamy's discussing this, where Stalin felt really threatened, rightfully so. And he says Stalin had probably expected a coup, which I had no idea that actually happened. Now he looked surprised and relieved after the Mikoyan and some of the other, I think some of the other Soviet officials came in the room and started talking to him, Molotov and some of the others, that it kind of brought a sense to relief to Stalin, because he found out, there's not going to be a coup. We're just coming up with a way forward here. And so Bellamy says Stalin was testing the loyalty of the other Politburo members, maybe military commanders as well. And so Stalin was completely paranoid. Like, I knew that Stalin was paranoid, but I had no idea that it was this, to that extent. I had no idea. And then it talks about like how initially the Soviet response to the invasion was so disorganized and problematic, but then over the course of the following months and years, they became very good, very much more organized in their response and their way forward in the war. And there's another, in that same chapter, when Stalin first comes back to make his first speech since Barbarossa started, he evokes Russia, Imperial Russia, which I thought was so fascinating, that Stalin, someone that viewed himself as a person of the people, that he's carrying out the people's will, the communist people's will. But in his speech, he says that this is like a speech he did on July 3rd, shortly after the invasion started. He says that Stalin led the country with promises and driven it with whips for more than a decade. He was a very iron-fisted leader. We think of Stalin right away when we think of a dictator. But after a suitable, lengthy 12-day pause, everyone was family now all of a sudden. In Stalin's speech, he referred to everyone as comrades and citizens, brothers and sisters, and fighters of our army and fleet. That's how he referred to his people, the average Soviet. And this change, Bellamy says, this change of approach was closely linked with a new emphasis on traditional Russian patriotism. So Bellamy uses Russian, the word Russian, not Soviet, which you would think he would emphasize Soviet, since the Soviet Party was still relatively a young political party or political movement. But Stalin was evoking the Russian patriotism. I thought that was fascinating. He chose to use the word Russian and not Soviet. So Stalin kind of had this patriotic sense, but not so much in the communist sense, the Russian, almost, I think of that as him evoking like Imperial Russia. So I thought that was interesting. But yeah, I would highly recommend this book. I think most people know about this book and have read it probably if you're interested in World War II, but I really liked it. It was really good. And I want to read more on the war in the East, because that was really good. But yeah, those are all the books I read and recently. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.